Oh, are we freezing up?
No, welcome back to the show, everybody. This is the Upper Tier Podcast. Tonight, I am joined by a very special guest, a man who has worked for WWF stroke WWE, a best-selling author, producer, dare I say, pro wrestling professor nearly at this stage, I could dare say, because calling you a pro wrestling fan really doesn't do you justice, does it really?
Well,
But I'm,
by the way, we were freezing. The picture was
yeah,
freezing.
yeah.
Should I log on again,
No, it's all good there. It's all fine now. It's no problem.
Niall? See,
Yeah,
I
you there?
even it. Yeah, I see you. You look like you're. Well, hello. You just talk for a minute.
Yeah, can you hear me there now?
Yes. See, you. Yeah, but it's not good. The picture freezes every few seconds.
Okay, just
Let,
bear
let me
with me
try
1
logging
second.
in one more time.
Yeah, cool.
Okay. Okay, good. So log out and log in. Okay. Should we give it a try again?
Yeah, let me roll that back there again. So you can hear me now there. Everything's good. You can hear me okay?
No, no. Maybe I should bring it into another room. I'm really sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Try that then.
I'm wondering if it's the part of the house I'm in. Can you see me all right?
Yeah, I can see you fine.
Yes, see, I'm only hearing. Okay, I'm going to go into another room. Give me one moment.
Perfect. No problem.
Okay, okay. Let me try it and see if it works elsewhere.
Cool.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, let me try. Okay, I'm going to give it a shot. Okay, let's see if this is better here. Okay, I'm looking at you. So far, so good. Let me turn on some lights. Okay. All right. And okay, I think I'm feeling a little more up. Now you see my bed. Okay, there. That's better. Okay, good.
How is that? You can see me and hear me now?
I can, yes.
And you
Bizarre.
can see me moving if I move and all that stuff.
Yeah, I see you going back and forth.
Perfect. Okay. So let's begin again. Welcome back to the Upper Tier Podcast, the podcast that we bring you each and every week. If you could head out to YouTube, smash that subscribe and bell notification button. And tonight we're joined by a very special guest, Keith Elliot Greenberg, best-selling author, producer, pro wrestling professor, I would say at this stage, not necessarily a fan. How are you, my friend? No.
Oh, there
You're
you are.
free.
Hold on.
Yeah, you're freezing up
Yeah,
there
I
again.
see you. What's that? I'm freezing?
Yeah, you're freezing on the screen there, yeah.
Oh, for fuck's sake. Okay, I'll try moving it one more time.
No problem.
Otherwise, I'm afraid I might have to go out to a cafe or something. Okay, which I'm not adverse to doing. Okay. How about this? Yes, no?
Yes. So can you hear me now?
I can hear you, yes.
And you can see me?
I can see you. Yes.
Okay, let's go with that then. All good.
Okay.
So, welcome back to the Upper Tier Podcast, the football podcast and pro wrestling podcast we bring you each and every week. Head out to YouTube, smash that subscribe and bell notification button. And tonight we have a special guest, Keith Elliot Greenberg, best-selling author, producer, pro wrestling professor, dare I say, because calling you a pro wrestling fan doesn't do it justice at all. How are you, my friend?
I am a wrestling fan, though.
Okay. So where to begin with this? Talk to me. Born in the Bronx in New York, living as a moment, as far as I know, in Brooklyn, is it?
I live in Brooklyn currently.
Live in Brooklyn, yeah.
The borough I identify with the most, and if I see these are all Queens themed tattoos over here. That's the number 7 train. I'm very proud of that train. My favorite subway line in New York City.
Okay, so tell me, let's roll it back to the start then before we get into the meat and gravy, the main course of this. Talk to me about growing up as a kid in the Bronx.
Well, no, I grew up in Queens. I moved to Queens fairly young. I was born in the Bronx. And so I grew up as a fan of baseball's New York Mets because they were in Queens, as opposed to the Yankees who are in the Bronx. But that's not what we're here to talk about. I grew up as a wrestling fan. My grandparents, who were from the former Soviet Union, were true believers. They thought they were watching actual life and death struggles on TV. I imagine it would not be so different than growing up in the UK and Ireland and watching World of Sport with your grandmother, and your grandmother, thinking that Mick McManus was a disgrace to the Irish race. My grandparents truly thought that the villains were evil people, and they were in their 90s when I finally began working in wrestling. And sometimes I'd make a remark that say, Jimmy Hart's a pretty nice guy. And they'd be, what? He hits people with a megaphone. So, they never made that transition to accept the business as sports entertainment.
like so many other fans. So many other
fans. In fact, I even feel that my father's feelings were hurt a bit, although he was cynical about the reality of pro wrestling himself. I think that when the WWF, now WWE, came out and actually said that it was entertainment, I think he was a bit hurt because he'd invested some of his emotions into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk to me about when writing, when you bit the bug for writing and all that started.
Well, if you count drawing a paycheck to write, which, I'd say that's when you become a professional writer, when you receive your first paycheck. So I received my first paycheck for writing when I was 19 years old. So that means I've been a professional writer now for 45 years and no desire to retire. Plus, I'm not going to be able to retire with a house that my ex-wife lives in an apartment that I'm in just a few blocks away. So fortunately, I like writing, and I like writing about professional wrestling, among other topics. But I really am addicted these days to writing about professional wrestling, in some ways, even more than when I was younger.
Yeah, I was scrolling down through the list of books that you've done and stuff like that, and the variety and the dynamic and the range of stuff is just, it's unbelievable, really, when you think about it.
But you see, you have to make a living as a writer, so then you learn to become versatile. And I guess if you're a general practitioner, you become familiar with a whole range of ailments, even some ailments you don't encounter right away. I do some corporate writing too. And when I do corporate writing, that's a client and they're paying me, and I take it as seriously as anything else I write.
Yeah, absolutely. So how does the process begin? Let's say how do you arrive at, say, I mean, if we talk about Ric Flair's book or Classie Freddie Blassie or Superstar Billy Graham, rest in peace, of course, Superstar. When you talk about those books, how do you arrive at that point, and how does the involvement and all begin?
Well, I was fortunate that both superstar Billy Graham and Freddie Blassie had known me for a while, and they both requested that I co-write their books. Ric Flair, I was put on him. He, as I recall, wanted a friend of his to write the book, and his friend was not an author. So both WWE and Simon and Schuster ganged up on him, and they anointed me his co-author, which was quite good for me in the long run. Whether it was good for him, you'd have to ask him. And as a matter of fact, don't ask him, because he and I have been getting along really well these days, and I'd like to keep it that way.
And how was that process with Rick, the putting the book together and stuff like that?
Well,
How did that journey go, if you like?
Well, Rick was an active wrestler at that point. He was in his 50s, but he's genetically unusual. He was adopted. Sometimes I think he's an extraterrestrial, because, he was really wrestling good, compelling matches in his 50s when, other people have been retired for 10 years. And so he was busy. And his kids were in high school at the time, his younger kids, including Charlotte, who's now, perhaps the best female wrestler of her generation. She was a volleyball star in high school at the time. And so he was busy with his kids, and he was busy with his WWE schedule, and he was busy being Ric Flair and, living the gimmick. And so it was hard to buttonhole him and get him to tell a story, but he would. I'd be able to get him. At the time, I was on retainer for WWE's publications, and I'd corral him, and I'd ride in the car with him. Sometimes Triple H would ride with us, which was honestly immensely helpful. The two of them were in that faction called Evolution at the time.
Evolution, yeah.
And, Triple H is a historian, a pro wrestling historian himself. So he understood the origins of certain holds we were talking about. And sometimes I would ask Rick a question, and he would say, I understand what Keith is trying to get at. He just phrased it wrong. And he had some insights, about what it's like to be inside that ring. And, there were, with all my books, there have been people who have stepped forward and contributed in ways that are not heralded. And that's an example of that.
Excellent. Awesome stuff. The move into then the WWF magazine and WWF and stuff like that, how did that come about?
Well, I was already writing about wrestling. I mean, I was very young, as I told you, when I started. And so, pro wrestling was a topic I knew quite a bit about since I'd grown up watching it. And, there was a period when I was in college when I backslid a little bit. Like, I probably wasn't religiously watching it, but I would watch it periodically. And I did go, I remember going to Madison Square Garden because Bob Backlund, the WWF champion, was wrestling. I'm sorry, he was the WWF champion. It was the Worldwide Wrestling Federation then, was wrestling Harley Race, the NWA champion, in a title versus title match. And even though I wasn't watching, on a week-to-week basis, I did go to Madison Square Garden to see that with a girlfriend. My grandparents were living in Florida by that point, and when I would go down to visit them, which was normally about twice a year, because you could get, there was an airline called People Express, which would be like the, Northeastern American equivalent of Ryanair or EasyJet. And so I could get down there for, fairly inexpensively. And I always went to wrestling. It was every Wednesday night in Miami Beach at the convention center. So I would go there as well. But then I got out of college and I was working, and there was one Saturday morning that I turned on wrestling out of curiosity, and I was hooked again. I don't know if there was even one particular thing. It's just that I started watching and I didn't want to stop watching. And so I began pitching wrestling stories and getting people to take them because I could, I wasn't that great of a salesman for my own skills entirely yet, although I was confident. But when I spoke about wrestling, I guess I spoke about it with an authority beyond my knowledge, since there was so much I had yet to learn about the inner workings of the business. But just the fact that I knew a lot about wrestling and wrestling storylines and wrestling characters impressed these people impressed them at least temporarily, for them to assign me one story. I still think that at that point, pro wrestling was not looked at with a great deal of respect. Nobody understood, including myself, understood the marketing potential, the licensing potential, the sponsorship potential, the fact that it could become an international juggernaut. So not a lot of people were stepping forward and volunteering to do wrestling stories for mainstream publications, and I was.
Excellent. Excellent. That's really good. In terms of the WWF magazine and your work that you did on that and all, what did that kind of entail? Apart from, was it mainly writing articles? Was Vince involved in that at all? Would he oversee a lot of that stuff? And what was that kind of communication and relationship like?
Well, I wouldn't say Vince was involved with every article, but the WWF was much smaller, and there was an intimacy there that that would be impossible to have in a large corporation. And after TV tapings, Vince would sometimes take a group of maybe 25 or 30 people out to dinner, and once in a while, not always, I'd be part of that group. And I'd be sitting at the end of the table, and Vince would be over here, and Hulk Hogan would be over here, and there'd be people, there'd be fans there sometimes who Vince had taken a liking to. There was one dinner when there were these three sisters from upstate New York who always showed up, and Vince awarded them passes for life, and they started crying. And so when people talk about evil Mr. McMahon, I go back to that memory, and I've seen him be far less than evil, something quite different than that depiction.
Yeah, I can't complain on that level. I actually, Keith, I run a shop here in Dublin, a wrestling shop similar to the one, the Wrestling Universe.
Yes,
So
it's
I have kind of the equivalent of that here in Dublin. I've been running it now for about 20 years. So you won't ever hear me complain about Vince McMahon or WWE, because it helped
no,
me
you
put
would
my
be
it helped
invisible.
me put my kids through college, if you like. So
That's
never
right.
a
And
bad
you know
word.
what? My daughter was born through in vitro fertilization, and I subsidize, because we have such a generous healthcare system over here. I had to subsidize the in vitro fertilization with through my own hustling, and WWE, with the money I made from them, it enabled me to give birth to my daughter. Maybe I should sue them for that, though.
It's quite a lucrative business these days, apparently. So I heard. Um, Tell me this: in your time working on the WWF magazine, and to me, for us over here in Europe and stuff like that, the magazine was the Bible, basically. The excitement of going to get it and all, and it had to be pristine, and there was always like, what's going to be on this cover, what's the cover going to be this month and stuff. I went back and looked. We've some in the shop actually, and I went back and looked at them. The covers and all were sensational back then and all, and I always remember old WWF programming. They would say, like, if you got on the cover of the magazine, you were a big deal, and you'd
Yeah.
hear Mean Gene
And
going, "This
the
week's."
wrestlers believe that.
Yeah, yeah,
It's sometimes a story becomes a fact.
mm,
Yes, of course that was hype, but the wrestlers did believe that. And when wrestlers were not featured in the magazine, they would complain about it. And Bill Apter, who had been at Pro Wrestling Illustrated for years and years, he said the same thing would happen to him. It happened in every promotion. Like, how come I'm not in the magazine? And sometimes if they were particularly bitter, they'd say, why are you featuring this other guy? I've done more than him. I'm better than him. And it's funny now, some of the veterans, the old timers will call me and say, how come I'm not in the WWE Hall of Fame? It's like, I don't make those decisions. Like, no one's ever even insulted me on it. But if you watch those A&E documentaries, underneath my name, it says WWE historian. So I guess that's why they assume I have a role in that.
Yeah, you're the go-to guy. I want my Hall of Fame ring. I want my episode on A&E. I want all of this. I've done this in the business. Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I'll give you a funny story. Last year, I was at WrestleCon in Dallas, and I got to meet the Powers of Pain and Demolition, two of one of my all-time favorites, especially that switcheroo match. It lives in my memory forever. But I got a set of custom figures made, Funko Pops, for Demolition to sign. And on the back, I had that purple magazine. Remember the one they were featured on the cover? I had that as the backing on the Funko Pop. I had great detail. I had the tag belts on them, the whole lot. And when I showed it to them, the two boys teared up. And I said, don't tear up yet. I said, wait till you turn it around. And when they turned it around, the magazine cover was on the back of the box. And they couldn't believe the detail and stuff like that. And it was interesting. I got talking to the four of them about that match with Fuji that time and all. And it was an incredible experience to see them interact.
It's wonderful. And, I say this on a lot of the interviews I do. If you love this business enough, which you obviously do, you opened a store, you subsidize your family through it. There is a place for you, whether it's working on a ring crew or taking photographs or selling merchandise, and you can have those interactions, and I do feel that pro wrestlers are pretty accessible, even the big names. I was on the road with WWE enough to see The Undertaker and Kurt Angle and Bret Hart and Eddie Guerrero interact with people, Randy Savage, interact with people all over the world. And, I wrote a book with Ric Flair. I saw, even when Ric Flair was playing a villain, he would give the people, it was a backhanded insult. In other words, he'd be taunting them, but he would be giving them a slight compliment too. So they're like, wow, Ric Flair just said my girlfriend was good looking. You'd say, I'm signing your autograph, but if you had her asked me, that would have been a different story. And so all these people, every day of their lives, they've learned how to make others feel good, both by what they do in the ring and by their interactions with them. And then you have this experience where you show, this magazine cover to them and they start tearing up. And I think that's a beautiful thing about professional wrestling. And it makes me feel privileged to still be involved in the business. What's the name of your store? What's the name of your store?
It's a Wrestling Mania.
Wrestling Mania.
And
where is it in Dublin?
It's it's at the top of Grafton Street. So if you're familiar, it's in the top floor of the Stephen's Green Shopping Centre. Just at the top of Grafton Street.
I was there in October, and it's funny, when I was leaving, I jumped in the taxi. And I'm like, I feel like there's a couple of things I didn't get to do over these last few days. And I drove by first the Sinn Féin shop. And I'm saying, I didn't go in there. And had I known about your place, well, that would have, taken up some time. That said, I had a wonderful time. I walked down to Trinity University and looked at artwork and looked at statues. And I've been to Dublin, I think 4 times prior to that. And it was still, enriching.
Excellent. I was actually away at a wedding last weekend? I think it was last weekend or the weekend before, and I get hit up on Instagram, and who's outside the shop taking pictures? The Blue Meanie, and I had met. He's a great guy. Great guy.
Have you met him before?
I have, yeah. I met him at a couple of WrestleCons. He actually did a favor. A friend of mine who comes into the shop, his health wasn't too good, and he's a huge fan of the Blue Meanie. And when I met him at WrestleCon, I got him to do a little video, a get well video on the phone that I could send to him. And he did the video, and it was brilliant. And I said to him, I said, look, if you're ever in Dublin, hit me up. I owe you a lunch.
Oh, he's
and of
that
course,
kind of guy, yeah.
and he arrived on the door the day I was away at a wedding and stuff like that. Unfortunately,
Yeah,
but it was nice to see him there.
He's one of my favorites, and I can remember it was the 2013 WWE Hall of Fame, and I was there as a fan, and I was now since Inside the Ropes magazine started in the UK by my dear friends Kenny McIntosh and Dante Richardson. Now I always have an assignment for the Hall of Fame and for WrestleMania and SummerSlam and Royal Rumble. But prior to that, there were a lot of years where I didn't have assignments. So I attended that Hall of Fame as a fan. And I'm watching the Hall of Fame and someone taps me on the shoulder and it's the Blue Meanie also there as a fan. And this is a guy who's wrestled on WWE cards, but he wasn't too proud to be seen in the audience and enjoying himself like everybody else.
Yeah, I was the same. I went to WrestleMania 24 in Orlando in the Citrus Bowl, and we bought the tickets on Ticketmaster, just random tickets, nothing put together around like that. And when I sat down, sitting right in front of me were about 10 kids, all looking like those Russian dolls, the way they open up.
Yeah.
It was Haku. And I couldn't believe it. I was sitting right beside him, and there was a couple of guys with me, and I was looking at him, and he was in a polo shirt with a baseball cap, and I wasn't too sure whether it was him or not. But then I said, a guy with that back and that neck, he has to be Haku. And I went over to him, and I just shook his hand. I said, I'm not going to interrupt you. Just thanks a million for everything. And he goes, cool. He says, do you want a picture? And I said, I'd love a picture, but I said, I don't want to draw anyone towards you and kind of ruin it and stuff like that. And he says, I really, really appreciate that and all. But it was Haku. He was sitting there right beside me at Mania 24.
That's the guy. It's funny you bring up the Blue Meanie and Haku, who are two of the people who've been really nice to me throughout the years. And I remember one time, I remember where I was in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And I guess I had taken a taxi to the arena from the airport. And it was the end of the night. And I was trying to get a ride back to the hotel. And nobody was offering me a ride. And I was standing around thinking, well, I guess I'll go to a payphone, because this is before cell phones, and call a taxi. And Haku overheard it, and he goes, no, you're riding with me. Don't worry about it. And whenever I see him, usually it's around these like big weekends, whether it's a SummerSlam weekend or a WrestleMania weekend, but he always makes it a point of coming over and saying hello. And I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's when you can tell, isn't it? That's when you can tell. Yeah, no, that's really, really cool. Tell me this: is there a? I know this is a tough one to probably recall and stuff like that, because there's been hundreds of them and stuff like that. Is there a WWF magazine issue or article that you did that sticks out, that always comes back to your mind, or you recall all the time? Or as I find when I look at these magazines, I find every time I see a cover, it brings me back to a moment or a time or my memory of buying that magazine and where I was and what I was doing and stuff.
Because I was writing for them, when I think about wrestling magazines I read as a kid, yes, there are definitely covers that bring me back. When it comes to an article, I do remember there was that period where Raw magazine were doing articles where people could speak out of character. And I did an article on China, like who Joni Lauer really was as a person. And she was a very bright person. She could speak Spanish. She could speak German. And, she'd been through a lot in her life. And, she had also suffered a lot because people said that she looked manly. And she was struggling because she'd had, breast enhancement. And then she said, but here I am teaching women to look like, to be themselves and not compromise for anybody. And she had part of her jaw shortened because she felt her jaw was too prominent. And it was just a very honest interview. And I came away from that feeling very warm towards her. And there was a feeling I retained the rest of her life. And when they did the A&E biography on her, I was chosen to be in that. And I read that article again, and I tapped into the things that I felt. A sad part of that story is that towards the end of her life, and I told this story when I was interviewed, but it didn't run the show. I mean, the show was sad enough. Towards the end of her life, through a mutual friend, I was told that she was living in Japan and that she'd been working on a book. And she had written a book before, co-written a book, and that, she'd like me to look at it. And so I was very excited to see the book because I remembered how intelligent she was, and how much depth she had. And when the email arrived, it was fairly rambling, and I could tell that she was probably still abusing drugs, and it was, a bit heartbreaking to get up to page 4, and it's like, wow, I can't really do anything with this.
Yeah, absolutely, China. Let's talk about these 2 books. These are very interesting. There, Follow the Buzzards: Pro Wrestling in the Age of COVID-19. Talk to me about this one. Of course, for COVID-19 and for the lockdowns and the shutdowns, for a lot of people, it's very, very difficult.
Well, it's funny. One book is a sequel of the other in reality.
Yeah.
Too Sweet is about the indie wrestling revolution. And that ends really in 2019 with 4 guys. It's Jungle Boy, it's Joey Janela, it's Marco Stunt, and it's Orange Cassidy do their last Game Changer wrestling show for the time being in Asbury Park, New Jersey, I believe. And they drive down to Washington, D.C. for the first Dynamite broadcast. And then the book ends. So there was a natural, I requested a sequel because what happens to the indie wrestling revolution now? And my executive editor at ECW Press, Michael Holmes, said, yeah, do a sequel. And then COVID hit. By the time I finished the epilogue, an international pandemic had been declared. And so it became a book about pro wrestling during COVID. And if you've read the book, and even if you haven't, we all remember what it was like. I mean, we watched a WrestleMania largely in an empty arena on a soundstage. In fact, for an article I recently did for Inside the Ropes magazine, I spoke to both Dolph Ziggler and Otis. And if you remember, they had this angle going where it was Sonya Deville and Ziggler were trying to prevent Otis from getting romantically involved with Mandy Rose. And Ziggler said he was disappointed because when he was finally thwarted and Mandy Rose and Otis enjoyed a kiss, it was on a soundstage and not in front of a live crowd. And I made that observation and Follow the Buzzards. But then I saw Otis a day later and brought that up to him. And he said, hey, I still got to kiss Mandy Rose and get paid for it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just to let people know, links to buy both books are in the description as well from Amazon as well. If you want to pick up the book, both books, they're excellent. What was kind of the difference in these 2, as we know? I mean, the one thing I always say about WWE, no matter what is thrown at them, they will find a way. They will always find a way. They're that dynamic in the way. It's that ball rolling down the hill that can't be stopped. It doesn't matter. There's a few kicks on the way down and stuff like that, but it will always find its way. And I don't know, for a lot of people, if you're a pro wrestling fan, and I think a lot of people during the pandemic and the lockdowns and all went back to wrestling as well, because it was more or less kind of what was only on offer.
Yes,
because everything else had pretty shut down.
It was almost like the early days of television. The early days of television, they didn't have really a lot of programming. So
Mm.
in the US, they would put pro wrestling on. And, that resulted in one of the many wrestling booms. That was the year of Gorgeous George, late 40s and early 50s. And pro wrestling is a cyclical business. So, there was a boom and a bust, a boom and a bust. It's a cycle. And yes, it was like that because pro wrestling was on every single week. Both AEW and WWE produced a show every week. It was often in empty buildings, but it was on, and it was episodic, and people could follow it. And so there'd be cliffhangers, and you could tune in again. And even with WrestleMania, it wasn't done live. They taped it beforehand. They were concerned, what if the pandemic gets worse? We better tape a lot of this stuff in advance. So they were essentially taping Raw and NXT and SmackDown and WrestleMania, like, sometimes all of that stuff in the same day in different phases. But it was there. And what I found extremely interesting was that people bought wrestling merchandise during that period. You figure you're just alone in your house. Why are you buying merchandise? And as a father myself, I'm imagining that what would happen was that these kids would say, can I have an Otis t-shirt, since we were talking about Otis? Well, can I have a Orange Cassidy, gimmick? And, if you're a parent, you're like, a poor kid can't even go outside and see his or her friends. Get a couple of things, because their merchandise just boomed during that time. And wrestlers, as I say in the book, indie wrestlers were able to make money. They went on Patreon, they went on Cameo. They were able to monetize even their limited fame for fame that, like a guy like Danhausen, he was essentially doing stand-up. He was doing a TV show. And people were paying to see it. And that's pretty great. A lot of wrestlers are gamers. So they went on Twitch and they were interacting with fans that way. But, like Joey Janela says in the book, he goes, hey, it's better than sitting at home with a bunch of your T-shirts in your garage and no one wants to buy them.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, how dynamic they can think and out of the box the way they can think, because they're primarily creative people anyway, because they have to be in terms of their character and storylines and everything else that has to go on, stuff like that. So it's not surprising when you put something in front of them, they find a way to circumvent it or lap it up or make it better and all that kind of thing. And I think for fans as well, with the merchandise and stuff like that, I think they kind of felt an obligation, because everyone was trying their best to entertain you, keep you upbeat, all this kind of stuff during this time, which was at times was quite dark and depressing for a lot of people and stuff like that. I think people felt, look, they needed to give something back to make sure that they showed their appreciation for, as they say, the show will go on kind of thing,
And I think that extended in other areas. I know I saw it. I live in New York City, and people would make it a point to go to certain restaurants and pick up takeout, or as you'd say, takeaway, just to make sure they were patronizing the restaurant. In fact, people would go to bars and buy the drinks rather than just going to the liquor store, buy the drinks through the windows. So they were, keeping those places occupied. And in fact, no, this is not a joke. There's a strip club near here, and people would go by there, and I think they could order their drinks and the girls would be dancing like in the far background, but they couldn't interact with the customers. And then, they put their coats on because it was winter time, and they'd come outside and with a bucket, and people would throw money in the bucket because, they wanted them to, make money. And, they were also making money through OnlyFans and other vehicles. And that exploded too. It's part of the phenomenon. And, you can mock it, you can condescend toward it, but it's like wrestling. These are all ways that you're satisfying needs in people, that you're giving people means of escape. And, you should be lauded for that, not, scorned for that, because you're obviously making people happy in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. Morris is in the comments. He says some lovely cold Carlsbergs were
I
consumed
did,
a
yes,
few
I knew
months
those
ago.
from Maurice. Yes, a few months back, and Maurice, we bartered. I gave him a copy of the book, and he bought me a bunch of Carlsbergs. I think I
Absolutely.
came out a little bit ahead on that.
Yeah, my brother Ian off Dynamo's Dozen is in there as well, enjoying the show. Ian does a pro wrestling podcast with me on a different channel as well. Bit of fun and stuff like that. I want to pull one here. Here's an interesting one. This will lead us into my next topic. Daz is in. He says, for you, Keaton Niall, what does he think about Triple H and Vince on Raw? That dynamic that's there at the moment, of course. I think people outside of the business and the circle try to create this kind of internal struggle and battle that's there.
First of all, look, I think that creatively, I've been enjoying WWE. I don't think there's a person who watches wrestling. I have heard a few people say that they don't enjoy the Bloodline story, but that there's also a few people who say the Beatles weren't that good. I think it's at that level. In terms of the dynamic between them, all I know is this, and I don't want to talk about this in too much detail, but a pro wrestler who I know of, his family needed some funds recently, and he was a star with WWE, and I started communicating with WWE, and I was told that it went up to Triple H, and then yesterday I was told that it's gone all the way to Vince. So if they're pooling their resources to help somebody who's given to them, good for both.
Awesome, absolutely. And the next part, your favorite Hogan match of all time. Now, this leads me into the next topic, because I know you're working. I don't know whether you're working on a new project and you've completed it, or you're still working on it.
Oh no, I've probably done half of the interviews I'm going to do. I'm doing a book now. The working title is Bigger, Better, Badder. Or is it bigger, badder, better? I'm trying to remember now what the slogan was of WrestleMania 3. But it's WrestleMania 3 and the year that everything changed, because that was the pivotal year. Once WrestleMania 3 occurred, that people no longer said, why would someone fill up a football stadium to watch wrestling when it's not a real fight? It enshrined WrestleMania as an institution, and it created this whole almost religious pilgrimage feel that we have today, where there are, dozens of alternate promotions showcasing their stuff that week, and where people come from all over the world. And it also pretty much sent a death knell to some of the other promotions that were competing with it, including the NWA, the Crockett version of the NWA, because within a year they were in '88 they were purchased by Ted Turner, and it was the end of Jim Crockett Promotions. Vern Gagne and the AWA closed up shop, and World of Sport changed. WWE started to tour Europe that year in '87. They were in France, not in England. But World of Sport lost its joint promotions, lost its slot, its regular Saturday afternoon slot. And sometimes you'd have to switch around the dial and look for them. Sometimes it'd be joint promotions tapes. Sometimes it would be the Dixon's All-Star Wrestling tapes. And sometimes it would be WWF. And WWF kind of overshadowed everybody else. So it was a very significant year. And now you want to ask about my favorite Hogan match of all time. And you were going to bring up Andre the Giant. right?
Well, I was going to lead you in that way because I know you're working on that project. So,
Yeah, and look, I recently look. I mean, I was watching some of Hogan's stuff recently in Japan. You know,
amazing,
and
amazing.
he's working. You know, he's not doing just flexing and putting his hand to his ear. He's doing wrestling moves.
Yeah,
And Andre the Giant. In North America, we'd only seen him as a baby face, but in Japan, they'd seen him as a heel. Like I was talking to Dave Meltzer for the book. I said, "Oh, no one ever saw Andre work as a heel before." And he goes, "Well, I did. I went to Japan and saw it." I go, "Yeah, but you're Dave Meltzer. I mean, besides you." But
yeah,
I watched every second of WrestleMania 3, like was studying every second and took notes on it. And there's a beauty in the simplicity there. I mean, obviously, Andre the Giant was in failing health. He was in immense pain. And Jerry Briscoe told me that one of their fears was that Andre and Hogan might not be able to have a compelling enough match. So they made sure to have Ricky Steamboat and Randy Savage on that show because they knew those guys could really go. And when I'm watching that match, there's this moment where Hogan has Andre in a bear hug. Andre has Hogan in a bear hug. And it seemed now you'd say, well, it's a rest hold. But when I was just watching it, Hogan sold it like he was having the life squeezed out of him.
yeah.
And that is a statement about both of them. Certainly, it is nowhere near Hulk Hogan's best match. In fact, if I'm going to pick my favorite WWE match, maybe Hogan and The Rock in the Toronto Sky Dome could have been my favorite. Hogan went in as a heel and came out as a baby face.
Yeah, the switch again, and I just remember the psychology in that match and all. Like you're 10 minutes into that match before they even locked up, kind of thing, just working the crowd and all. It was crazy stuff like that. Yeah.
Wrestling, it's sports entertainment. Again, Hogan did know how to wrestle. Like if you watch his stuff from Japan when he's with Inoki and those guys, he knew how to work. Japan, they would test you out. Those guys were trained in a dojo. But Hogan was trained by Hiro Matsuda, and Hiro Matsuda was not very forgiving to guys who had a good cosmetic look. And so he knew how to work and he knew how to defend himself. But Vince McMahon was marketing Hulk Hogan as a crossover personality. And the crossover personality, wherever he traveled, he had to do, the hand to the ear. He had to do the flexing routine. He had to tear off the shirt. And, he had to, whip the guy into the ropes and give him the big foot and give him the leg drop. And that's what Hulk Hogan did. And people went out of their minds because I was there. I was there in England when he did it. I was there in Poughkeepsie, New York when he did it. I was there in Northern California when he did it. I was there in Texas, and everyone went crazy for it.
Yeah. I actually, sometimes when people ask me about Hulk Hogan, I describe him, if you've seen that Nobody Speaks documentary, when he said that Hulk Hogan and Terry Bollea are not the same person. And I turned around, I often say Hulk Hogan in Japan and Hulk Hogan in WWF are not the same person. That's how I kind of sum it up. And I remember that time when he was talking, remember he got into trouble over the real world championship title and all this kind of thing. And it was crazy times back then. Absolutely. Yeah, I have to say I do have a soft spot for 6. Hogan Warrior is a soft spot for me.
I was at that match too. And again, Hogan is obviously leading that match. I mean, the Ultimate Warrior was not a real gifted worker. And I don't like to bash anybody. I've never taken one bump. But again, give Hogan a little bit of credit. With Andre, there were limitations. He made him work. With the Warrior, he made it more than work. And I think Randy Savage's match at WrestleMania with the Ultimate Warrior was one of Randy's more satisfying matches because Randy calculated the Undertaker, the Warrior's limitations, and he zoned in on what can this guy do, and let's do the most with it. And that's the art of professional wrestling.
Yeah, I remember one of my memories coming out of WrestleMania 3. It was Savage and Steamboat, and they brought me on this journey because obviously Steamboat with the neck injury and the bell and the build up to all that match with George Steele and all that kind of stuff. But I remember right after he won the belt, then he dropped the belt, the honky, and it just broke my heart. Broke my heart because I couldn't believe it. I'd followed him he had nearly chased down Savage for God knows how long to get this belt and this title, and then when he got it, then like that. It was gone, and I was going, oh no, this is so not right after that match at WrestleMania 3.
And you know what? That's all valid. I mean, we all have opinions as fans. Thing is, I don't like to go online and start, second guessing decisions that have nothing to do with me. Like, as a fan, I know what I like and I don't like. I know what I did like and I didn't like. A lot of people were extremely disappointed after this past WrestleMania that what's his name? That Cody didn't win the title from Roman Reigns. And at the press conference afterwards, Roman Reigns said this isn't fast food. In other words, where this is long-term stuff. And for all the people who texted me and said, I'm never watching again, I would bet you the vast majority of them watched Raw the next night.
Absolutely. Yeah, I found actually when he said that in that press conference, and I think the press conferences now are really cool because they give you a real good insight. But when I heard Roman talk that way, it triggered a thing in my mind. Are they starting to reset sections of the business back to the way it used to be, kind of like the territory system back in the day? Obviously, there's certain sections of the business you can't because they've to output so much content, the internet, everything else, podcasting and all that. But if you look at like the way they're having less matches, but the matches are longer and more meaningful, the build up to the matches you're getting more emotionally involved in. Then all these premium live events where they're going to different parts of the world or the country, they're taking those local people, and like Selena Vega down in Puerto Rico, they came over here to Clash at the Castle in the UK, and it was Drew McIntyre.
McIntyre and Sheamus and Gunther. They had a killer match over there, and I think I remember watching that, and there was NXT was that weekend, and I wrote about this in Inside the Ropes, and NXT was in it, and it was around that weekend, and AEW had a show that weekend, and I remember I wrote about this. I said, thank God I don't have a girlfriend.
And then you see them, they're doing Night of Champions, and then there's talk they're going to go to Australia, obviously, with Rhea Ripley and stuff like that and all. And I was thinking, when I sat back from it, I always remember when I watched wrestling back way when, the way NWA would tour around, and they would go down to the Von Erichs, and the Von Erichs were the big deal there, and Flair would ship into town and do the job and stuff like that and all that kind of stuff there. And then they go back to the Carolinas and down to Florida and down to Jerry in Memphis and all that. And I'm thinking, because WWE now is such a global company, you can't just kind of travel around the States. They have to go kind of all around the world. But it's kind of...
Go ahead. Yeah, please.
No, go ahead. Go on.
No, and like when those Saudi shows started in 2018, I thought it was like a house show. This was a great show, this last Night of Champions. Now it's almost like Saudi Arabia has grown into them, and they've grown into Saudi Arabia. Now those shows are meaningful shows.
Yeah, I did it on a review of the show, actually. I turned around and I said, this is a huge event. The fans are much more into it. When you remember the first shows was kind of a lot of rich people sitting around on couches and all that kind of thing. Now it's proper fans, merchandise on them, getting into it, all the chants, who they like, who they don't like.
And they're chanting in English. That's what blows my mind. They're chanting in English. It's like when I went to Japan with WWE in the early 2000s, I remember the fans in Japan were chanting in English. At one point, the late Wally Yamaguchi got in the ring, and was translating, and the fans booed. They wanted only announcing in English. They wanted the full American wrestling experience. And it seems like the Saudi fans are reacting the same way.
Yeah, I said to people after the show and all, when I look at this now and the way they're putting it on and the whole spectacle of it and the way it's laid out and all, I'm getting like big four feels out of this. I'm feeling Rumble, I'm feeling Mania, SummerSlam, right. Survivor Series. That's how I'm starting to feel about these premium live events. They're huge now and stuff like that.
Yes, they are.
Take a comment here. Kenny is in. Kenny Noble. Great to see Keith. Very cool stories. Kenny was in with me a few months ago. Kenny is an author as well. He wrote a book during COVID called The Greatest Show on Earth, all about WrestleMania. He went back through all the WrestleManias through his eyes as a fan. And he did some cool artwork for the book and everything and all. So really cool. We launched it.
Kenny, I believe, and I have communicated. Yes, I know that book. Yeah, it has really, really cool illustrations in there.
Yeah, he did all the illustrations and the whole lot and all. Really, really cool.
Yeah.
Now, will this do reviews? What would be your favorite era and favorite storyline angle?
You know what? I say this all the time. Our favorite era is usually whatever era existed when we were 11 to 13 years old. That's usually my answer there. I talk to folks who, like a lot of the folks that Inside the Ropes are in their late 30s now. Their favorite era was the Attitude Era, which I enjoyed too. But I don't know, maybe my favorite era right now is the Bloodline era. And it's an era where we're seeing some great AEW shows too. We have the All In that's about to occur in Wembley. I imagine Will Ospreay will be on that show. Okada will probably be on that show. That is going to be an international showcase.
Historic.
So I'm going to say right now is my favorite era.
Awesome. Let's talk. JR is in as well. JR is an interesting one for you. I read Keith wrote articles for Playboy magazine. Can you ask him his opinion on Hugh Hefner? And can you ask him was he at any of the parties at the Playboy Mansion?
I didn't have to go to parties at the Playboy Mansion. You should have seen the decadence that existed in Queens, especially when all the Irish started moving there in the early 80s. That's awesome. My answer.
Awesome answer. Before we wrap up, of course, we'll get you to talk about what you're doing and where you can be reaching, stuff like that. You have to talk to me about superstar Billy Graham, who passed recently. You got the opportunity to speak at the funeral, which I called not so much a funeral but a celebration of life, because I don't believe you lament your heroes, you celebrate them. And I thought some of the people who spoke there, it was fantastic to see it. It was excellent. Talk to me about probably the privilege of being able to do that for a superstar. It must have been amazing.
It was a privilege. There's some sadness mixed in there, but I was able to maintain a close relationship with superstar Billy Graham and his wonderful wife, Valerie. When everyone else pretty much isolated themselves from him, or he isolated himself from others in the wrestling community, his wife was still there, dealing with his health problems, dealing with his sense of bitterness for the business not taking care of them. I think he was disappointed that he couldn't give her a better life, and Valerie always stuck with him. And I think that wrestling fans need to remember that she's still here and she needs all of our support, both emotionally and there is a GoFundMe that the family has set up, and even if certain bills are paid, they're going to be bombarded. She's going to be bombarded with medical expenses, and it's really just her shouldering that burden. And I would just recommend, if you have a few bob to spare, it's a good cause. She's certainly not going to go out and exploit that.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember my first recollection of Superstar as a kid. I did have obviously go back and watch his matches and stuff like that because he was absolutely groundbreaking and he paved the way and stuff like that. Often people have said if he hadn't have been a heel and he had been a babyface, he would have been Hulkamania. He would have been the queen of Hulkamania.
Vince McMahon personally told me that. He said, had he been in charge and not his father, he said it in the book I co-wrote. He said he would have been my Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan.
Absolutely. Yeah, my first recollection on WWE TV was when they covered. Remember, they went in and showed the hip operation.
Yes, they did.
And he was climbing and the rehab, and he was climbing up the mountain, and he was in the bed, and he had all the ring gear.
Climbing up with the walker, and the walker falls, and then he just keeps going.
Yeah. I think the guy who used the cover on the special report was it Craig the Charles was his name or something like that.
No. Craig DeGeorge.
Craig DeGeorge, that was it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was incredible. That was my first one, and I remember him coming to the mountain, and he had the walking frame, and he threw it down, and he says, "I'm gonna get to the top." And he always wore the weightlifting belt and everything and all, and it was just he was so cool. I remember that storyline with Butch Reed and everything and all. It was crazy and
great.
Butch Reed, what a heel! He was so disrespectful. It was unbelievable.
Yeah, although in reality, Butch Reed was quite fond of superstar Billy Graham.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but it was brilliant times. Yeah. So, listen, I really appreciate you coming on. It's been absolutely fun. Looking back, I think everyone in the comments are just blown away by the knowledge and the commitment to the business that we love and all that kind of stuff. Tell people where they can find you on your socials, kind of what you're working on, what's coming up.
You can find me. I'm on Instagram. I am on Facebook, although I'm almost at that 5,000 friend mark where then they cut you off. And I am, I am on Twitter. It's funny. After the Royal Rumble press conference, all these people were bashing my questions on Twitter and making fun of the way I looked on top of that. And I got like 200 more followers that night.
Brilliant. Absolutely. Well, that's fantastic. Listen, really appreciate you coming on. We could do episodes of this because I know you've done stuff on Michael J. Fox, one of my all-time favorites as well, Family Toys, Back to the Future, Bruce Springsteen, the E Street Band, all that kind of stuff. I loved all that as well. Jesse Ventura's in there. There's stuff on sharks, marine biologists. There's all sorts of stuff in there. It's quite the variety. I'd be interested to see in the library what the Keith Elliot Greenberg section looks like and the mixing and on the range.
Yeah, maybe they'll open one in like Limerick City or something. No one suggested it in New York yet.
Oh, can you imagine? Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, a pleasure as always. Thank you for taking the time. And we will talk very real soon. As you know, folks, links down in the description if you want to purchase any of Keith's books out there on Amazon. You can also contact us at the uppertierpodcast@gmail.com. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, anywhere you'll find us. Audio versions of the show are on Spotify, Amazon Music, and Google Podcasts. And we will talk to you again real soon. Cheers, my man.
That was fantastic.